It was written that in 2020, 300 people of diverse identities and genders, adults and children, would build a town where two rivers meet on desecrated land. They are the children of Compost, always striving to make kin with others. They stay with the trouble, making a living on spoiled lands, trying to restore them. Their community considers babies precious and rare. They are rarely birthed and most often have 3 parents of various genders. Some of the human newborns are genetically modified to be related to other species under the threat of extinction.
This was not a prophecy, but a fabulation, a work of the imagination for the possible future, written by Donna Haraway. It's 2020 and we thrive on stories, but what kind of stories do we have now? Most often narratives of climate apocalypse and techno-dystopias. We can't go on just with this, so what can we learn from these children of Compost?
For them, kin is abundant, made not through blood, but through relations of care. The story envisions a world in which human numbers slowly decrease, mostly as a result of cultural remaking of kin relations. Family is freed from being just of one ideal kind, that kind being nuclear, heterosexual, and encouraged to reproduce. The children who are born in this future are loved and always nurtured, and so are the elders. The refugees are welcomed. The children of Compost make kin and refuge with others, humans and non-humans, through the hard work of care, of mourning the lost, and of holding open space. Haraway wrote a motto for them and for us. It is make kin, not babies.
Donna Haraway knows the dangers of speaking about population, but she doesn't leave the topic off the hook to be defined by right-wing politics. Focusing on population as a problem has a long history of racism, colonialism, and genocide. This is why the response has been fierce. Sophie Lewis wrote about Haraway that if she wanted to do justice, she should have centered her analysis of population on how it relates to border policing and white supremacy, which, according to Lewis, she doesn't, and is thus trafficking irresponsibly in racist narratives. This was not the end of it though. Haraway had breakfast with Lewis and talked it through, tapping upon their points of agreement on reproductive justice and their feminist background. Making kin cannot be racist, so Haraway kept exploring the trouble of population, knowing that population, both as human numbers and as a concept, will not go away.
What's bad about the concept of population? Michelle Murphy explains how population in the 20th century became a calculative concept used by nation-states for the sake of economic productivity. Population as a way of counting uses an abstraction for a managerial gaze, and over time, it was open to ongoing management, legitimating projects incorporating American interests to cover the globe. Population, seen as a problem, has created infrastructures that have a terrible history and a present of having weaponized birth control practices, of coercive sterilization, of border walls, of racist violence, and of choosing elite lives to be protected.
What is needed is radical reproductive justice that supports life in the face of racist and colonial structures, and that bleeds into environmental justice, which includes water and land, because what happens to the land happens to the people.
Looking at population as a problem shifts our focus from the low fertility, highly consumptive, elite lives to the many lives whose work and exploitation sustains them.
Population points to babies rather than borders and systematic inequality as culprits for poverty.
In the hand of the current arrangements, the concept of population seems irredeemable. Yet, human numbers grow, even if the counting of them is done by a violent machinery. How do we make it so we can care for each and everyone in this world, without caring only for those that are deemed valuable? Cultivating kinfulness is cultivating life,
writes Ruha Benjamin in her account of Black kinship. Adoption, foster care, cousin culture, and caring for the dead, saying their names, are all essential practices of kin-making.
But is caring real work? Haraway's make kin, not babies, should be seen, according to Jennifer Hamilton, as an act of restructuring work and family, while challenging the role of the private home within the economy. For the children of Compost, much of the trouble is already over. There is no racism, no sexism, no fear of the other. This is incredibly hard to accomplish. They do caring all the time. It is work, and in that sense, how to transition to having everyone do housework when housework right now is devalued and undesirable?
Inspiration can come from myriad places in space-time. Kin Tolbert encourages us to
resist a linear progressive representation of movement forward to something better or movement back to something purer. For one, decolonization is not an individual choice. We must collectively oppose a system of compulsory settler sexuality and family that continues building a nation upon indigenous genocide and that marks indigenous and other marginalized relations as deviant.
Haraway proposes that we should find ways to celebrate new forms of making kin, including the decision to not give birth, and fight for non-racist immigration, environmental and social support policies for newcomers. She proposes freedom not just as a choice, but also from the coercion of the gendered system, and she urges us to imagine and work for a world in which all babies are precious and cared for, not just some babies.
For her, refusal to talk about population from a feminist perspective leaves the subject to be defined by conventional environmentalists and other professionals. Her initial training as a biologist, and particularly one who wished to make biological knowledge that isn't shaped by patriarchal or capitalist ideas, put her at this difficult crossroads. Population helps one talk about other species and habitats, and it can also teach us about huge differences in human inequality, for example, with studies that show differential excess mortality. How the urban poor die at much higher rates than the urban wealthy. What we need is a change in the conditions of knowing and acting, and there is much to learn here from indigenous governance.
In these times of climate and ecological crisis, refuge for humans and non-humans becomes harder to find. We must work towards making the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, shorter. Neither man or capital should be the driving force of geological change.
For this, not only our economy should change, but a lot of how we do relationships and caring too. Haraway is giving us another name to point not just to the past and present, but to the future. The Chthulucene, a time of ongoingness, a calling for intense commitment and play that makes possible the flourishing for rich, multispecies assemblages.
It is in this time that we must make kin, non-natalists and of category, take care of each other and stay with our troubles.
Not run from the dirt, and not try to purify it either.
This is about more caring, not less.
Ultimately, all earthlings are kin in the deepest sense.
So what can we take from make kin, not babies?
One can find inspiration to rekindle old ways of making and keeping kin, and to reaffirm extended families, or to bring about new forms of kinship and support that aren't strictly human and that aren't rooted in patriarchal values such as monogamy or heteronormative romantic love only. Such making of kin must always know the history and present in which it lives and act against othering. These kinds of cultural practices can free women who do not wish to give birth from the stigma, and it can give those who wish the opportunity to seek support beyond the immediate family. And whether or not we make babies, we can always strengthen our relationships with others, humans and more than human people. And yes, of course, families aren't always nuclear and based on romantic monogamous love, nor must they be. We can celebrate multiple forms of making family, and we shouldn't enforce just one, especially the one that is most servient to capital. Besides, whether we live on indigenous lands or not, questioning this Western family model is one way of resisting power, of trying to find what was lost and of making new ways of being together. While for some people there are antinatalist policies because they are considered undesirable, for others states make pro-natalist policies, desperate to have more of the right babies and right kind of workers and citizens.
If we follow the threads that led to these policies, we find them to meet with the threads of ecological destruction and exploitation. And then, if we untangle them, we should do it with this vision in mind. The land, the people, the living others, all are parts of our extended bodies that we should care for, collectively.
So, what do you think? Should we give up the concept of population, at least until this profit-driven, growth-based capitalism is gone? Should we be against it altogether for the way it has been used and it is used? And if we don't talk about human population at all, how do we talk about the population of other species, especially in these times of mass extinction, but without being speciesist? And what about making kin? How to create new forms of strengthening relationships, or of finding inspiration from old ones, and maybe even succeed at it without enforcing just one model as the best. This script has been pretty hard to write as it tackles such troublesome ideas.
We have been driven to it for the making part, but ended up spending much more on the not babies.
That spiky part, yes.
So we are curious to know how you find these ideas and how to talk better about them. And if anything sparked your interest, maybe like, subscribe, anything. Sharing is caring.